David, I'm sad to report that I've just experienced one of the most grotesque displays of tyranny, certainly that I've ever personally witnessed in 48 years.
Yeah, I think you've just implied that in our pre-discussion, and it's scary, and it requires the Americans to wake up.
Yeah. What I'm talking about is my previous video where I was in City Hall Park, and the NYPD decided maybe 30 minutes into a peaceful protest, nobody was fighting, nobody was burning anything, that we're just simply not allowed to assemble. I guess they haven't read that part of the Constitution that talks about inalienable rights. The governor is not allowed to shut down the Constitution because he doesn't want people to assemble. There were a number of people who've told me that there was some kind of anti-Trump protest just the other day, but officers of the New York City Police Department told everybody to leave the park, and obviously you would have been arrested if you didn't follow their instructions. You know, David, when you get arrested in New York City on a Friday, you sit in jail until Monday before you can even see a judge or your lawyer generally.
Yeah, it's sobering, and but I imagine that the people of Hong Kong would understand very much now what the people of New York are going through.
It's a sad day, David. I mean, I really feel like there's been all this time where people have kind of said, oh, you know, if we don't do X, Y, Z, these bad things are going to happen. But here it is. You can't go to the park and, you know, exercise your constitutional rights to peaceably assemble and try to affect change. I don't know what to say, David. I'm at a bit of a loss for words.
Well, why don't we just go into the collage, which you magnificently put together, because that I think will bring out some characters and personalities that might recognize that what they've been praying for since the 1960s and 1970s, they're well on the way to achieving.
Right.
And so we're looking at this collage, and just along the bottom, and that's how you and I last night, we discussed what might go on this image, and you capture the essence, I think, very well. The six people, three men on the left and the three women on the right in the lower foreground of that image. This was from an image about the most admired men and women in the world. And this was, I think, dated 2015 and 2014. I think you checked the source of that, but what really intrigued me are the people that whoever it was who put that poll together selected these three men on the left and these three women on the right. So on the left, we have Bill Gates, and over on the right, we have Angelina Jolie. Now, most people perhaps don't realize that there is a fascinating connection between Bill Gates and Angelina Jolie, because Bill Gates, in his wisdom, has decided to fund a BBC education program to educate 7 to 14-year-olds. Now, I don't know if you have any relatives in that age, what you think, but I don't want any relatives of mine to be educated by Bill Gates.
No. Or Angelina Jolie.
Yeah. Or Angelina Jolie. But as I understand it, the BBC show, education show through BBC Studios, will be hosted by Angelina Jolie, all right, and funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So then we need to look at what message Bill Gates is punching or promoting or using to penetrate. Go ahead.
Well, look at this. I just brought up Variety, which is like, you know, kind of the New York Times of Hollywood, the mainstream entertainment press. I didn't realize, David, that the purpose of the BB show was to help kids spot fake news.
And because this show is, a lot of it is unscripted, that's the first time I've seen in the preamble that word fake news, because fake news is a fascinating concept. And the BBC is probably the world's leading authority on the injection of fake news,
Yeah.
and has been since the 1930s. Right? Now, this company, Circa, we spend a great deal of time talking about, is retained by the United Kingdom Cabinet Office to do resilience training, for example, in the case of a pandemic, which shows government workers or government employees, I suppose, including the New York police, how to respond to an emergency.
Yeah.
Right? And they inject news to give it a touch of realism. And my point, as you know, I always like to dig into the patents. What we discovered some months ago is that the BBC has a patent that applied for on August the 3rd of 1998 for a spoken text display apparatus for the generation of television signals. And euphemistically, you could say, instead of generating television signals, why not generate fake news?
Yeah.
Right? And send instructions to organizations like the New York police about what they're supposed to be doing while the BBC is transmitting fake news through probably unwitting newsreaders. That is to say, the newsreaders are given a script to read, right? And they read it, like Jane Stanley in New York on 911 in the afternoon. She reads from this machine that you're just showing up on the screen, a prompt which says, "We're getting news that the Salomon Brothers building is coming down." Unfortunately for the BBC and what I might allege are the conspirators, the building is still showing over her left shoulder, right? Which means that she's reading a script, right, that has been synchronized with a series of instructions to the various teams that are going to be told to bring the building down. According to the ethics or mantra of the BBC, listen and obey.
Right.
And you have pointed out, and a number of people, I don't know if they've laughed at you or not taken you seriously, you see, and I'm seeing more and more, this notion of steganography.
Yep.
Where in an image, let's say that image with Jane Stanley right there could be a steganographic message for the people on the inside who would recognize that what she just said actually has to be translated into an instruction to bring the building down, right? She says the building's collapsed, right? She doesn't say it was demolished, right? An artificial intelligence algorithm could take that script and convert it into an instruction to a demolition team to demolish the building, which they did about 15 or 20 minutes later in a bottom-up demolition. But let's just go back to that collage, because I think the collage gives us a wonderful overview of what we're going to be talking about in the shows. So you've got Bill Gates on the left, right? And he's considered to be, back in 2015, and we might rhetorically ask our audience today, do they still think he's the most admired guy in the world, right?
I
And
can't
then over on the
imagine.
right, Angelina Jolie, who back in 2015 was considered to be the most admired woman, right, in the world. And again, I think I would ask the listeners or invite the listeners to do a straw poll or something and see if they agree that Angelina Jolie and Bill Gates should continue to be the most admired people in the world, right? So then who do we have to the left of Bill Gates? We have Barack Hussein Obama, previously known as Barry Spataro, former president of the United States, and an alumnus of the Sidley Austin law firm in Chicago in the period, I think, about 1989 to 1990 to 1991. And he's shaking the hands of President, how do you pronounce his name?
Xi
Pres-
Jinping, I believe.
Xi Jinping, right? So you've got Obama, the president of the United States, shaking the hands of Xi Jinping, the president of China. And these people appear to have been in a project together for quite some time, because Barack Hussein Obama in 2014, I think it was, there's a video clip of him talking about the importance of getting America's infrastructure ready for a viral pandemic. And he makes some very interesting decisions over the next 1 or 2 years, because the Affordable Care Act is then approved in Congress and Senate, and an extraordinary sum of $1.2 billion is set aside to fund the development of what presumably is the Obamacare database or the Affordable Care database by the British company Serco. And Serco is a fascinating company because Bill Gates in 1994 outsourced the United States National Visa Center.
Bill Clinton, not Bill Gates.
A correction, yes. Bill Clinton outsourced the operation of the National Visa Center, that's the United States National Visa Center, to the British company Serco. So from 1994, right, the aliens and immigrants and so on have been coming into the United States, including, I believe, the sleeper cells of the Bin Laden group, courtesy of this British company Serco. So this is an extraordinary company because it's also been given by Obama the opportunity to operate the United States Patent and Trademark Office. Well, that's quite powerful, isn't it, Jason? You've got the ability, a British company, to operate the United States National Visa Center and the United States Patent and Trademark Office.
David, where can we find a reference for people? Let's take a step back for a second, because we're talking about some things that perhaps some of our new viewers might not be directly familiar with. You mentioned steganography, and for people who are maybe not familiar with that term, I want to reiterate, it's just simply the practice of encoding or embedding messages in plain sight. So if there's some kind of, newspaper article that somebody would read and say, oh, Bill Gates purchases 33% of whatever, or some scientist in China is 33 and dies, or 33% of whatever. That Epoch Times piece on the origins of coronavirus told us that 33 out of 250 samples contained coronavirus. It could be just a normal occurrence of things counted, 33 things, or this number 33 could be a message to people who know. See, I've been trying to contact a bunch of people by phone, and it's interesting. I haven't gone into these details, David, but I have observed a strange occurrence of 33s in some of these people's phone numbers, and it's caused me to become curious, because there's a lot of people who I call who don't answer, because I believe I'm developing something of a reputation for getting people who perhaps are trying to lie onto phone calls and then asking them questions that they don't want to answer. And so their response, even in the absence of an answer, just as with our friend Wilbur Ross, become something of an answer in and of themselves. And so it seems like there's some people who just don't want to get on the phone with me at all. And I've observed that some of these people that I'm calling, many of which have not yet been introduced to the Crowdsource the Truth audience, have 33s in their phone number. And it causes me to wonder if somebody out there got a phone call from an unknown number, but perhaps if it contained a strategically placed 33, it might indicate to them that this is a phone call that you should answer. Here's Wilbur Ross. He didn't want to talk about the patent office, David. He wanted to talk about space. Now, the other thing I wanted to ask is, we've frequently spoke about, and I even asked U.S. Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross about outsourcing the Patent and Trademark Office's services to Serco. Where can we find the announcement that Bill Clinton did that?
Oh, it wouldn't be Bill Gates. It would be a statement on the Serco website that they've been running the Visa Center since 1994. And then under news on the Serco site, you'll see a reference to they've renewed the contract for the operation of the United States Patent and Trademark Office, where they're using artificial intelligence algorithms, right, to process the patent application. And on the 17th of November of last year, Serco, the British company, processed the 4 millionth patent for the United States Patent and Trademark Office. And my point is then, Serco is in a position, so it's very important we know who its shareholders are, to cherry pick these patents and basically clip them together in a template, which is a template that I offer on my website of 10 patents that I believe allow Serco and its shareholders to inject fake news into the BBC. That is to say, when the BBC sets up an education service with Bill Gates to help people recognize fake news, this is actually a double cross, in my opinion, because the BBC knows or ought to know that it is being used as a channel to inject fake news into the collective minds of the sheeple, the people, basically. And we see it most clearly with the transmission of the statistics relating to the death figures of COVID virus, where they're extraordinarily precise and extraordinarily and criminally inaccurate. But I think, yes, just leave that image there. Now, this is on the outside of Broadcasting House in the United Kingdom. And for me, and I'm happy to take a different reference from other people's opinion, this looks like a sexualized naked boy Christ being crucified, and a couple of angel-like figures, at least they've got wings. One of them is holding a book to the genital area of the naked boy Christ, right? And on that book, it says obsculta, which is the first word. And thanks to one of our listeners who wrote us in when we were fishing for an explanation for that, apparently it's the first word in the Benedictine Creed, and it means listen and obey. So I think the BBC, wittingly or unwittingly, has been sending steganographic messages, at least as far back in 1970, alerting its audience, which is up to 500 million weekly audience around the world, that there are certain people within that audience who are going to get an instruction following that steganographic message, and they're going to have to listen and obey. And it may be that the instruction is, well, take the coronavirus from the National Microbiology Lab in Winnipeg and take it to Wuhan City and spread it around the food market so that it looks as though the Chinese planted this infection within Wuhan City, right? Where, as we know, it generated hotspots, at least from a simulation point of view, that allowed the Wuhan City to be the first, and this is extraordinary, to respond to that particular coronavirus, COVID-19, with an appropriate vaccine. Because my understanding is you can't produce a vaccine until you've got the virus.
Right.
So how long, go ahead.
Well, sorry, how long what?
How long have senior people in the American government been producing, let's say, blood that contains viruses with which you could develop a vaccine if you were so minded, such that a certain target community would die young or die old, but a community to be saved could be vaccinated and protected and carry on with a new administration? Go ahead.
Well, no, you're closer than you think, David. Before we get to that answer, though, I just wanted to speak on your previous question. What if the NYPD are given the order to listen and obey? They're telling people you're not allowed to peaceably assemble in the park. And obviously, when the NYPD tell you to do something, if you don't listen and obey, they're going to stick you in a box and probably hit you on the head with a stick. So someone's got them listening and obeying, despite the fact that the criminal, the governor of the state of New York, Andrew Cuomo, has no God-given or otherwise bestowed upon him power to nullify the United States Constitution. These are supposed to be unalienable rights. Look at this shameful individual who turns away from me. This guy's some kind of highly placed NYPD officer, and he won't even answer the question when I ask him, how does it feel to be part of the destruction of the Constitution? The NYPD became a force of tyranny today, enforcing a criminal order against the people of the United States, against freedom. I reject the notion that any of these men are heroes. They are cowards, and they should refuse these criminal orders. But instead, David, they listen and obey.
Correct. And there's various explanations for people doing what they shouldn't be doing. There's that classic spectrum of sex, fear, greed, and power, right, that we can cover. But let's go back to the entry collage, because that is such a powerful image, at least. And thank you again, that people who are joining us, I think we can put a picture together. So just before you made that point about the NYPD, I was talking about, or making a rhetorical question, who as a senior political leader in the United States might have become involved in the production of tainted blood for the purposes of identifying viruses that could subsequently be the catalyst for the vaccine.
It's better than that, David. I know you're going to say Bill Clinton and talk about the blood scandal in the Arkansas prisons, and I do agree with you that that is part of this thread. But there's a doctor who's come forward just in the past couple weeks, initially interviewed by Mike Moore of True Pundit, who appears on More Pain on Tuesday nights here on Crowdsource the Truth. We also should remind everybody watching, David, that in just about 25 minutes, you and I will start our sponsor exclusive show, and we hope that people will join us for that on patreon.com/reverse-CSI storyboards, patreon.com/crowdsourcethetruth, and subscribestar.com/crowdsourcethetruth. But what Dr. Judy Mikovits reveals in this interview on the Thomas Paine podcast is that she worked for Anthony Fauci at, I believe, the NIH. I could be wrong about that, but they were working together to create an HIV vaccine. And what Dr. Mikovits discovered was that the substrate upon which they were cultivating the viruses, you need living tissue to recreate these viruses. And so they take, other mammals that are genetically similar to humans so that the virus can grow in those cells. We've heard from she's not a doctor, but Judith Very Baker, that she was doing cancer research with Alton Ochsner in the 1960s, and they were growing vaccines on, I think, monkey pancreas cells that had a simian virus in the pancreas cells. Dr. Mikovits reports very similarly that the mouse brain cells that they were using to grow these viruses to create a vaccine for HIV, the mouse brains had a virus in them that was giving humans who were, taking this vaccine, was giving them chronic fatigue syndrome and causing cancer. And she blew the whistle on this. And Dr. Fauci destroyed her career, accused her of stealing material, research material from the lab, had her imprisoned for a while, took all of her hard drives and her documentation. And she presents some really compelling evidence, and she says that the vaccines themselves contain viruses, and in fact, she says if you've had a flu vaccine, they have coronavirus in them. So you get vaccinated for the flu, then they test you for coronavirus, and they say, ooh, you have coronavirus, you better stay inside your house or get beaten up by the NYPD.
Yeah, so let's go back with Hillary Clinton, go back to the 70s, all right? So we have at the University of Arkansas, Hillary Clinton is lecturing on criminal law, and Bill Clinton is lecturing on constitutional law. And the physicians at the University of Arkansas's Medical Service Center, for some reason, and I think it's related to what we've just said, are collecting prisoners' blood, at least up to the 1978 period when Clinton became governor, as I understand it. And this is a very lucrative activity because apparently prisoners will sell their blood at $7 a pint in return for script. They don't get given dollars for that. And then you can take that blood, and this is what was happening in Arkansas, and then subsequently under the governorship of Bill Clinton and first governor's lady, Hillary Clinton, ship it up to Canada, right, to a wholesaler in Montreal, who would then send it to Connaught Laboratories in Toronto. And that's really interesting because then Connaught Laboratories would turn it into a plasma and move it into, for example, Africa and drive the HIV epidemic into Africa together with Ebola and all other kinds of horrible things. So essentially you have a criminal organization that connects, in my opinion, what would subsequently become the Clinton Foundation, but certainly prior to that, the Clintons, to a dirty blood racket that was run through the modern times as the technology improved over that phantom secure radio network, where, as you point out, you can take a BlackBerry mobile, take the guts out, put an insert in that allows you, in theory, to communicate over a social network of criminals. I think they serve 20,000 criminals in what may be the most powerful or lucrative protection racket ever, because what we're being told, and I think what you're experiencing or you're about to experience in the United States, there will be people like Bill Gates and Angelina Jolie that are transmitting fake news through the BBC, the world's leading broadcaster, with a weekly audience of 500 million people, that is telling young people and their parents, right, listen and obey. That is to say, do not gather in crowds, do not exercise your rights to protest anything in particular, particularly like in Hong Kong. Because what was terrifying the communist dictators in communist China was that the protests in Hong Kong would spill into the mainland and the communist revolution is over. Now, let me just go back to your cover page and this woman, Bernardine Dawn, because this is vitally important. This is the thread that I think is actually connecting the fear of the NYPD to what might happen to them and their loved ones if they don't listen and obey. Now, this woman, Bernardine Dawn, is a psychopath, and there's no statute of limitations on murder. Now, she was the leader, together with Bill Gates, co-founder, if you will, of the Weather Underground organization.
Bill Ayers.
Yeah, I keep.
I do agree with you. Bill Gates is responsible for most of this, so it's easy to confuse it, but we want to make sure we keep people straight. Bill Ayers.
Right. So Bernardine Dawn is married to Bill Ayers, right? And these were the founders, from the Students of Democratic Society to the Weather Underground terrorist organization. So she's an extremely dangerous psychopath. And she's fascinated by the cruelty to human beings. She actually gives lectures, or gave lectures, at Northwestern University on torture, paradigms, and practice. Right? When you and I were in London, outside Broadcasting House, there's a statue of George Orwell or Eric Blair. And if I remember the words right, it says, if the word liberty is to have any meaning, it's the right to tell people what they do not want to hear.
Right.
That's a powerful phrase. Now, in his book, classical dystopian novel, 1984, right, he talks about a room 101 in Broadcasting House. You and I tried to get into it, right? We didn't get very far, but we walked and talked and looked at a number of the BBC people in that cafe outside. Then we crossed into the Langham Hotel. But what I think was fascinating for both you and I was there was the lack of, why should they think otherwise, the lack of awareness of what the BBC might represent, right? And what threat it might represent in terms of communicating a message, along that lines of listen and obey to a weekly audience of 500 million people. Now, this may require, and I'm not sure I've got my head around it completely, this concept of the cutout in espionage, I think, is very important. Yeah. Because I think what's happened to the BBC, it is now, certainly at a senior level, they must know, you'd think they'd know, it is being used as a cutout by forces like Bill Gates and his megabucks and the various agencies around the world who want to bring about a Marxist-Leninist revolution around the world. Now, Bernardine Dawn is a Marxist-Leninist as well as being a psychopath. When the Weather Underground was infiltrated by that Larry Grold, who's the FBI, he asked them, well, if your revolution is successful, how are you going to protect it? And the essence of the reply was, well, that a lot of Americans are going to have to be re-educated, and they're well on the way to succeeding with that, right? But they reckoned that they might have to kill 25 million Americans in order to secure their revolution. Now, that was what, in the 1970s? And I asked Americans, well, what's changed? You allowed Bernardine Dawn, I guess you couldn't stop it, to come into the Sidley Austin law firm, probably the most powerful law firm in the world, and apparently groom Michelle LaVaughn Robinson and Barack Hussein Obama to carry the banner for a communist revolution that took Obama's into the White House, where they could actually implement the communist revolution. Fast forward to 2014 or 2015, and you have Barack Obama introducing the Affordable Care Act and siphoning off. And I was going to ask you, because I think the $1.2 billion paid to Serco to implement the back office and database of Obamacare, or the Affordable Care Act, is being used now to divide the American population up into two groups. One is expendable, and the other is they've got to be saved as long as they listen and obey. There is no upper limit to the number of Americans that these people will kill. Right? Now, a nuclear bomb is clumsy because it might kill a lot of your friends. But how about tailoring a vaccine? Right? So it targets a particular category, a class. It might be age-related, of people who are going to be pulling on the Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, too much money. Right? So why wouldn't they take the prisoner blood? And let me just back up here. So the last shipment of dirty blood from the Arkansas correction system was in 1994. Now, the Clintons, being grifters, they would have said, well, we were making a lot of money out of that technique. How do we take it over? Hillary Clinton parachutes a bunch of her friends into the White House for the Travelgate scandal, right? She fires all of the people working in the travel office in the White House and replaces them with her friends from Arkansas. And I think they then introduced that in 1994, the integration of the Bureau of Prisons Transportation System and the Federal Marshal's Prisoner Transportation System into what is known as JPATS, Justice, Prisoner and Alien Transportation System, nicknamed Con Air. And I'm alleging they continue to run the dirty blood racket from 1994 onwards, except this time they had the seal of approval of the Department of Justice.
Well, I think they made it more sophisticated as well, David, because not everybody needs a blood transfusion. That really limits the scope of how you can distribute this. But if you were to embed the same type of thing in a flu vaccine and spend a decade pushing the concept that get your flu vaccine, come in here and get your flu vaccine, you don't even have to go to the doctor anymore. In New York City, I walk down the street, CVS, Rite Aid, Walgreens, they all say, come get the flu vaccine. They've been pushing this. Flu's been around forever. I never heard about a flu vaccine when I was a kid. And furthermore, I always thought vaccines, like you get them when you're born and then you're immune. What the hell is the point of it if you have to get it every year?
Unless they've adjusted the virus so that the old vaccine doesn't work. Now, just think of an industry patronized by the Clinton and ultimately the Clinton Foundation that takes dirty blood from various sources, right, which might include the downtown east side up in Vancouver, sends it to pharmaceutical laboratories and allows them to develop vaccines that can actually create, how shall I put it, a hybrid biological weapon that is part viral and part vaccine. That you can adjust.
Is that medically possible? Are you sure that that works? Because you see, what I'm envisioning, David, is they've got this, we've got evidence now that a scientist has said that this vaccine, it contains other viruses that do things. So you're vaccinated against one thing, but you got a virus that's doing something else. So if you take the flu vaccine, which is supposed to, prevent you from getting the flu, we've heard from a lot of people that it doesn't work, or even that they get the flu from taking the vaccine. However, how do you know if you have the flu versus coronavirus versus something else? I mean, if you've got a fever and a runny nose and some doctor tells you you have the flu, you're going to think you have the flu. But if you have a fever and a runny nose and you feel tired and you're achy and they tell you you have coronavirus, well, how the hell do you know the difference?
And that's very important, because with now the transfer of the BBC studios, I believe this transfer has taken place to serve as a cutout for the conspirators behind this, the BBC can be used to transmit fake data or false positives, or false negatives for that matter, into target communities like New York and London. And the public believes that there's an assault on the health of the citizens of New York. But you go around and you find out that the hospitals are empty or the ambulances are idle or whatever. So you created a perception. They're injecting a message that can, of course, be used, but I don't want to go there in too much detail, the cat bond. I want to come back to what can be done in order to the tyrants and the dictators to impose their will on the people. And let's go to Hong Kong.
But boy,
Hong
before we
Kong,
do that, David, I think it's important. We have not yet, we're 30 minutes into the broadcast, and we have not yet addressed the concept in the title. Did Sidley's Obamacare vaccine give us CanSino COVID-19? I think we've got to explain to our viewers what that's getting at, because in less than 30 minutes, when we transition to the sponsor exclusive show on Patreon and Subscribestar, people are going to be very curious what the answer to this question is. So did Sidley's Obamacare vaccine give us CanSino COVID-19? What is Sidley's Obamacare vaccine?
Okay, so let's go back to the cover page, because the cover page has all of the personalities, I think, and that's the people getting into this argument can start from there, right? So we've now talked about 3 Sidley alumni. Bernardine Dawn, who appears to have had the job of mentoring Barack Obama and Michelle LaVaughn Robinson, or Michelle Obama, at Sidley Austin. And the role of Sidley Austin as one of the most powerful law firms in the world in introducing this catastrophic and fatal arithmetic of the pandemic, because Sidley Austin secured a listing on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange for this CanSino Biologics company, right, which is shown in the background. I presume you Google that. I don't know, is that their headquarters office?
Yeah.
But there you can see behind President Xi the name CanSino Biologics. Now, I don't know if you remember the term the Sino-Soviet Pact, right? What intrigues me about CanSino Biologics is that Canada? And I think it is Canada, right? That is to say, the communist Chinese decided that in order to develop this vaccine viral combination would be too difficult under the supervision of, or the control or infiltration of what remains of the FBI as an investigative tool, right? And why not develop it in Canada, where they get a much more friendly reception, because previous Prime Minister of Canada, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, was in Beijing in 1973, signing a trade deal with Zhou Enlai and Mao Zedong. That is to say, Chinese. Sorry, go ahead. Do you want to?
No.
Did you want to say?
That is to say, Chinese.
Okay. So they floated onto the market this CanSino biologic, and it apparently is the leading contender to develop the vaccine for COVID-19 and get it into the market first. Now, isn't that interesting? But of course, they have a prime seat, because if the Wuhan city epidemic had broken out somewhere else, then you wouldn't have the concentration of sick people necessary to get the blood to introduce or develop the vaccine. So I believe if you look at Wuhan city, as we've talked about before, that's a hotspot that occurred, which is not consistent with the patient zero. So now, where in Canada might there have been a group of people who suspected this might be happening? That is to say, the virus or the vaccine was developed in Canada, and some of them wanting to stop it. Well, I've got one candidate for the show, the next part of the show, who died or was possibly murdered to prevent him from exposing this conspiracy. And his name is Barry Sherman, right? Now, the Sherman, or Barry Sherman, founded Apotex. And Apotex, and let me just read this so I don't get it wrong. Apotex did something very interesting. In a press release of June the 26th, 2017, Apotex launches a vaccine ordering website called Apo Access, an online vaccine ordering portal offering pharmacy a one-stop solution to their vaccine ordering needs. The new portal follows the acquisition of Reform Management's online vaccine ordering platform earlier this year. That's earlier in 2017, providing pharmacy with more than 50 vaccines, greater convenience, and enhanced access nationwide. And I think this is why Barry Sherman was murdered, together with his wife, because the people behind the vaccine for COVID-19 cannot coexist with a company that's introducing vaccines at a low price and providing them around the world. Now, most people probably haven't heard of Barry Sherman, but just very quickly, Barry Sherman was the founder of Apotex. He was a brilliant man. He was very litigious, and he would sue a lot of people in the pharmaceutical industry for infringing his patents or trying to keep him out of the market. So he created a lot of enemies in the big biopharmaceutical industry. Sometime in December, after 2 days of him going missing, at his 16,000 square foot home in Toronto, the maid, or the woman who was selling the house as an agent, saw their bodies in a very interesting posture. They'd both been hanged, that's Barry and Honey Sherman, from the rail of the indoor swimming pool in such a way that their feet were pointing away from the pool, and there was a belt around each of their necks strapped to the railing. So they died slowly in humiliation beside each other. And on their wrists, there were marks of a cuff or straps. When the Toronto police arrived, right, they said this was a murder-suicide. How can these two people, quite elderly, right, kill themselves, kill one and kill the other in a suicide? There, I think you've got the Toronto police terrified of revealing what must have happened. That was a double contract killing by a psychopath. And if Bernardine Dawn can lecture on torture paradigms and practice, equally through a network of killers, maybe the kind of people who are transported on Con Air, under the Clinton administration and onwards, you could send in a hit team and record a film of these two people dying slowly, side by side, and send that film to other people in the pharmaceutical industry and say, this is what happens when you mess with, well, what's going on in Wuhan City with the development of this CanSino biologics. Now, CanSino
Sorry,
biologics...
David, before you go forward, I want to just say a few things about CanSino biologics because I think there's some important things for us to observe. First of all, this is not a pharmaceutical company. They even call themselves biologics. And I think it's important for people to remember that the Vaccine Injury Act of 1986, passed under Ronald Reagan, reclassified vaccines not as pharmaceutical products, but as biological. And this changed the nature of the testing. And it basically was enacted because the pharmaceutical companies felt that they could not be profitable if they were subjected to all the testing and not able to introduce these vaccines in the way that they wanted to. So CanSino Biological is developing only vaccines. And we've spoken previously, David, how any company involved, even if they are good-natured and doing the right thing, any company involved in vaccine discovery is also inherently involved in virus discovery. And to take us back to what we were discussing earlier in terms of steganographic messaging, well, this could be a coincidence, but the Hong Kong office for CanSino Biologic is at 33 Hai San Avenue in Hong Kong. I'm sure it's a coincidence, but it's interesting nonetheless. The other thing, David, is, after you and I have our conversations throughout the week and the day before the show and everything, I always try to go over some of the things that you're telling me about and try to come up with, the image and different things. So Sidley Austin has several law offices in China. It appears to me, and I could be wrong, but it appears that their main Chinese office is in Shanghai, and I've located it here. It's interesting that Google Earth does not present buildings in Shanghai in 3D. We've often spoken about this in the past, how sometimes things are presented two-dimensionally in Google Earth. What I found interesting, David, is look at this. This is the Sidley Austin office, and somehow they've convinced Google to smear out the details of their roof. No other building in this area in Shanghai has a similar treatment. So somehow Sidley Austin has influence over Google that's sufficient to maintain the privacy of whatever is on their roof. What do you think of that?
Well, I think it's got influence over Google. Now, Sidley Austin also secured the listing for CanSino Biologics in Hong Kong and was given an award and some kind of recognition. And the issue now, of course, is you've got the Sidley Austin law firm with three extremely dangerous alumni: Bernardine Dawn, Michelle LaVaughn Robinson, or Michelle Obama, and Barack Obama, who created the Obamacare $1.2 billion funding of Serco in order to create a database for Obamacare that would allow you, hypothetically, to divide the American population in those to be sacrificed, right, and those to be saved, simply through the development of an appropriate combination of vaccines and virus. So it turns out that CanSino Biologics has been partnering Canadian universities, in particular McMaster University, on the development of this vaccine. And so I checked whether or not there's any connection between McMaster University, which is at Hamilton, and about my late wife actually was at an alumnus of, or alumna of McMaster University. It's about 60 clicks from Toronto, but that's by the by. But apparently there's regular visits by the microbiology students and staff or faculty at McMaster to Apotex. So I believe, and I think it's a legitimate theory, that Barry Sherman was aware that there was the development of a well, he wouldn't have used that language, but let's say I'm calling it a Sidley Obamacare vaccine that could be used together with a virus or a re-engineered virus to create a pandemic and basically shut down initially Wuhan City, but legitimize its reasons for developing a vaccine, and ultimately to spread that technique around the world, courtesy of Bill Gates and the BBC, into convincing people that now they must no longer assemble in public. They must maintain a distance greater than 6 feet between each other. They must never, ever protest, or their children are going to get vaccinated. And maybe they won't survive the vaccine, or they get incredibly sick. So going back to Room 101 and the psychopath Bernardine Dawn, I can imagine taking a population of perfectly decent men and women and their children and saying to the parents, we need to educate your children to make them, for example, believe things such as carbon dioxide is a principal component of catastrophic anthropogenic global warming, so we need to wipe out large sections of humanity, or that this particular virus will actually trigger such a pandemic in your community, you must have a vaccine in order to go to school, or go to bank, etc. And that's a level of control that probably back in the 1970s, Bernardine Dawn and Bill Ayers could only dream of. But right now, it's happening. And I feel you were kind of pessimistic at the beginning of the show about what you'd experienced in New York. I'm totally in agreement with you, but I'm just appealing to our audience. If we can clip into the kind of communication that is presently controlled and dominated by Bill Gates and Angelina Jolie through the audience, the weekly audience of the BBC, which is 500 million, if we can educate these people as to what's coming down the wire, we can turn the ship around. Now, I said before, I think it was yesterday, I've looked at that, the most admired people in the world, Jason, and I thought, you know, Jason Goodman should be up on that list.
You're too kind, David.
No fake humanity. I'm not being kind. I'm thinking, if you look at those 6 people along the bottom.
Well, they're despicable.
Well, exactly.
I don't know who this lady is. I shouldn't say that about her.
I think she might have had acid thrown over her. I think I don't know, I've had a scan. But just zoom out again and capture that just capture the whole group. And I'm explaining what I mean about the importance of getting someone like you up there. I mean, I admire you. I think your audience that have been working with you for many years, exactly, they admire you. But when you and I and the other people that you interview are up against the BBC and a weekly audience of 500 million people, we're going to lose unless we can get into that audience. Now, I'm just telling people, I happen to have a friend, it may lead to nothing, who's the former Director General of the BBC, Greg Dyke. His predecessor, John Burt, is the man who signed off on that patent application for the spoken text display apparatus for the generation of television signals that was registered on the 3rd of August, 1998, 4 days before the attack on the East African embassies. And I think the attack on the East African embassies, the American East African embassies, was carried out by some combination of the people that appear on that collage at the front page.
Wow. Well, David, we're just about out of time here on our YouTube section of the show. For people who haven't seen us before, we're going to continue the conversation and go even more in depth when we carry on in just about 10 minutes on patreon.com/reverse CSI Storyboards. That's David's Patreon page, and I hope that Crowdsource the Truth viewers will sponsor David and my other co-hosts. You can also watch the show on subscribestar.com/crowdsourcethetruth and patreon.com/crowdsourcethetruth. David, there's one more thing I wanted to ask you. So when you're saying that Sidley Austin did whatever with this CanSino biologic, I mean, would they have been the ones who select 33 High San Avenue as the address for the place?
Well, I suppose if steganography has a meaning, there's a little inner group that knows the meaning of those numbers. You know, like the neighbor of the Fisherman's Hall in London, which was
right.
Wells Fargo, which had the leverage lease on the Twin Towers on 911. Probably written by Barack Hussein Obama after he'd been working with Business International in New York, where he wrote on leverage lease and currency swaps. But you see, there's a difference between the handshake, the ritual that I think is developed over decades, if not centuries, that secures an inner group knowledge that they belong to the same group, they've signed the same oaths, they're going to listen and obey, and the external perception of that, and you pick it up as steganography. In some cases, it might be a coincidence. In other cases, it might be a method of communicating to what?
Look at this. Well, on Google Earth, they don't show the photo of that building. It's number 33, and it contains Wells Fargo Bank. But when you come to Street View, you can't see it. It's so interesting, David, what is omitted from Google and what is revealed.
Do you think that's an artifact? That is to say, the building hasn't disappeared.
I don't know. They obviously have the images of it because they use a technique, as far as I know, called photogrammetry to make all these 3D models of the buildings. So that means they have photography of this building, but for some reason they've chosen to eliminate the street level view, which would allow us to see that this Wells Fargo building right next to the Fishmonger Hall is number 33. This is like King Edward Street or something like that. So look, we see the building right there, but when we come down the street to read the address on it, this is curious. Yeah, now it's back. Sure. It's the amazing disappearing building. There it is, 33.
Well,
how come it was invisible a second ago? That's very odd. That is so odd. I don't get it. Well, David, we're out of time here. Perhaps I just wasn't far enough down the street. No, that wasn't there a second ago. That is bizarre. David, we're going to have to continue to explore this mystery and when we get over to the sponsor exclusive show. Sorry to rush the outro, but we do need some time to reset. I want to thank all of the generous sponsors who make Crowdsource the Truth possible, David. I would not be able to keep doing this for 3 years if it wasn't for people sponsoring the show. And I hope that they'll visit your site as well. I'll see you in less than 5 minutes when we make our way over there. Thanks for another great show, David.
Thank you, Jason.